Hi everyone, good morning and thanks for joining us. I'm Michelle, I'm Head of Marketing for OpenAthens and I'm moderating this session. So to start with, we've got digital library insights and a few publisher insights afterwards. So we're kicking off with Alvet. Alvet's a senior manager in the software services team at EBSCO and he's joining us all the way from Melbourne at the moment. So it's quite late for you, Alvet. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen and can you hear me okay?
Yeah, everything's good.
Yeah.
So just to remind everyone to pop questions in the Q&A box and I'll ask Alvet on your behalf afterwards. Thanks.
All right, cool. So I think I'll get started. So my name is Alvet. Yes, I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. And so for the next 25 minutes, I'll talk to you about a topic I've been working on, which is context-aware unified institutional knowledge services, an open architecture for institutions to offer a seamless user journey to content. So before I go into that, I just thought I'd give you a bit of a background about me. I'm currently a doctoral candidate. So as of this year, I'm actually in uni for the past 12 years, all the way making my way from an MBA and an applied finance, obviously all studying part-time. That's why it's taken me so long to even get to this stage. And of course, by trade, I'm a software engineer. And just in case being in uni wasn't enough, I've kept myself updated with industry certifications as well. I'm up to 20 by this point. I've been consuming a lot of information over the past, I guess, a dozen years. And so last year I was in a position to contribute back to the body of knowledge by contributing 2 papers, and I currently have a 3rd one under peer review. And so, but by profession, I am working for EBSCO. I'm the senior manager for software services, and I have the I guess, privilege of being able to travel to the different parts of the world that I've highlighted here, including Africa, Central Asia, India, and parts of Australia as well. So I get a chance to sit with customers and try and have a chat with some of their pain points. That's really where I start my conversations whenever I do visits. And so here's sort of an example of a slide that I pull up in terms of pain assessment. And most of the time, the challenges that they talk about is not really related to the services and the products that I'm dealing with. It's more generic. And so while I was in India, I was speaking to the chief librarian at All Institute of Medical Information Systems, and he suggested, look, at some of the topics we were talking about may be worth putting into a prototype and see if we could potentially put that in as part of his conference. And so I said, all right, let's create a scope around that and see if I can do some research. And so I started to do research in this area around see how we could improve the user journey. And so the first step was, all right, let's take a look at where the institutional knowledge services of the library is heading in terms of the trends. And so we're heading towards free open source software, open access content, and things are getting cloud native quite rapidly. To the point where there is lower barrier to entry with greater interconnectedness. The one thing that I noticed overall was that there was a bigger focus on administrator-centric tools like the catalog and the institutional repository and a few of the other services, and not so much on the end user-centric tools. And so that's where I figured, look, there's a bit of a gap. Maybe that's an area that I can spend a lot of research on. Again, being an engineer, sort of an architect kind of thing, I figured, look, let me take a big step back and see what's happening in the medical institute there and understand what sort of systems that they deal with. And also I used my own experience to sort of craft what you would call a context diagram that consists of a content management system that you'd find in a library, a discovery service, a knowledge base, interlibrary loan system, link resolver, institutional sign-in, and then eventually there was this column called resource provider. And so an interesting classification came out, at least for me, where I sort of classified these as resource facilitators and resource providers. And this included the catalog and the institutional repository and all of the other publisher provider platforms as well. And so that's why you don't see things like the catalog in here, because the focus now is not more on the resource facilitators. And so obviously being a paper, I did a bunch of literature review around CMS, the web scale discovery, institutional sign-in, electronic resource access and linking, and gap analysis and solution. So I won't go into a lot of the details around the research that I did, but I'll highlight some key points that will be instrumental in sort of making sense of some of the things I'll show as the slides go on. Some of the research involved, for example, the content management system eliminates the need for expensive customizations. Sites that I work with, they almost always tend to have requests for customizations, and if you try and do that across the different platforms, it can be quite expensive. And so content management system apparently turns out to be a very effective tool in that area. Other things around the search experience itself, where this is NC State University all the way back in 2013, did a bit of research and published a paper around if we could bring the search results into the website where the search box is rather than sending to a different platform, that actually improves the user experience and increases use in the services. The other aspects were around authentication and access control itself. So obviously the RA21 initiative, as a result of that, publishers supporting SAML can restrict access to offenders without blocking the entire institution's network, unlike IP restrictions. But a gradual transition with proxy and SAML running in parallel is required. So this is where a tool like OpenAthens really offers that hybrid solution, if you will. And then another sort of interesting topic around the knowledge base is being at the center of the universe. And so the knowledge base is acting as a central registry of an institution's e-holdings that can be referenced by the link resolver, discovery service, authentication system, and all of that. So really that central point to try and bring a customer's holdings into a central location. And again, being a research paper, I had to demonstrate a bit of rigor and all of the methodologies that go with it. Design science research method, which is more agile related and is used quite widely towards information systems and publication of those research. That's the methodology I've used. And so it's mainly related to developing artifacts. And so I used another methodology called design thinking, which relates to developing prototypes, and it involves steps like empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And so being somebody that's been in uni for about 12 years, I certainly am able to empathize with researchers and students, but there was something that was missing, and I figured, look, I might bring in systems thinking to feed into design thinking as well, and that's why you've got this layered stack of methodologies just sitting on top of each other. And the thing about systems thinking is you try and identify what the purpose of the overall system is. What are the elements, and then how they're interconnected. So rather than treating discovery as a system and say your OpenAthens authentication as a system and the knowledge base as a system, they are subsystems that come together in alignment to serve the purpose of the larger system, in this case being a digital library or institutional knowledge services. And so I use that, and there is a branch of systems thinking called optimization, which is really related to reducing complexity. So all of that information went into ideate, and so through this process of I guess iterative thinking and sort of designing this model sort of started to manifest in a way where you have a central interface where you could have the resource linking, which is very popular across library websites. You've got the knowledge base with the A to Z. You've got the discovery service, link resolver, interlibrary loan, link to resources that go out of the discovery service, and then all routed through the institutional sign-in to eventually get to the resource. And so this front end is all powered by the individual components, such as the discovery, knowledge base, link resolver, etc., using the APIs, if you will. And so this model, we started to sort of work on a prototype, and eventually, sort of presented it to the institution. But before we did that, we needed to make sure there wasn't anything that already existed. Otherwise, we'd just be reinventing the wheel. And so I took a look at some of the existing content management systems out there, such as EBSCO Stacks, Remote Access, BiblioCommons, LibGuides, to see what sort of integration they already offered. Do they offer? Obviously, they all offer content management functionality. What about web scale, global knowledge base, document delivery, etc.? And so the no's are essentially the gaps, which is where, all right, there is room for research and contribution to the body of knowledge. Let's get going. So through the prototype and eventually the actual development work that went into enhancing Ames's library systems, if you will, I went ahead and added in the OpenAthens login box. On the left here, you've got the search box right on the top. and you've got the linking functionality right on the right side. So again, the idea is a central interface that is sort of bringing all these systems together and unifying them. And of course, mobile access is extremely important. So making sure these components work on an iPad and also on, say, the mobile phone is extremely important. So that sort of user testing happen as well. Things like creating the OpenAthens registration form using the APIs that was embedded into the actual website as well. So that was part of the user journey. So at the end of the day, it's just go to the library site or the institution site and access the services. We don't have to spend time explaining what these different services and platforms are. Similarly, you've got the forgot password functionality that's been embedded again through the API as well, offering that more unified experience for the end user. Going back to the searching functionality, a user could type their search term on the top and then get search results from Discovery and its APIs right in that same interface. And so the need for opening a new tab, presenting search results in a different interface, that just didn't exist anymore. And so all the more reason for it to be more seamless from a mobile experience perspective as well. And the work also continued to bring in the link resolver. So if I found a resource that I wanted and I wanted to get the full text, usually you are sent to an intermediary page, which then gives you a list of links. Link resolvers are good in some cases where they are able to take the first link and send you directly to the publisher platform. In this case, just for demonstration purposes, I've actually used it as a pop-up as well. So the user can select the items that they want and go and get the actual full text. Similarly, if there is no full text in the library, it'll show us the actual request form link on the same interface itself, rather than sending the user off to another page for access to the form. So when I click on that specific link, I'm then sent to a form that is still on the institutional knowledge services site, which is, the information about the user can be captured on that page. And again, using OpenURL, the fields can be populated. Now, this form can either send an email to an inbox, or it can actually send information to another system or store it in the CMS itself. So a lot of the work went into trying to make sure the need to jump out of the system didn't exist, as long as it was a resource facilitator tool that was integrated using the API. And so here's another example of the A to Z browse, which is the knowledge base. So using the API, we brought that into the interface where a user can just use the A to Z browse feature and browse the journals that an institution subscribes to, and then use the facet feature functionality just to limit to the specific publications that they want as well. And so the GAP eventual summary was, all right, so where have we landed with unified institutional knowledge services? There are some, of course, features that were already there, but then the other ones that were not, they are now unified in terms of this actual solution. So finishing off what you would call the unified institutional knowledge services piece of the research. And so this was actually presented at the conference at the end of it. So I was pretty glad that it all worked out, considering it was about 3 months of work and research in the process. So this is eventually what happened. We went from a more fragmented experience across these different systems to a more unified experience, which is through the one interface. And again, the emphasis on how these components are situated is extremely important, because there are times where users may go straight from the resource links or the discovery straight into the resource provider, and then they've hit a roadblock saying, okay, I can't authenticate. This is why positioning something like OpenAthens or channeling all of the resources through the right authentication systems is extremely important. This was in many ways, I would consider, at least from a design science research perspective, more of an artificial analysis. So more realistic analysis was required. And this is where the context factor came into play. And so from a context perspective, this is going back to, well, I guess in some ways my first paper, where the focus was really on medical clinicians, and so a lot of this research was in that area around evidence-based practice, or EBP. And so there's been enough research around patient values and clinical expertise, but the area where I have my expertise is really around research evidence. And so just to give you a bit of a history, practitioners before discovery would have to identify the different platforms, and then they'd have to go into the various platforms and try and find the information that they want, which is extremely time consuming. Discovery comes into play and indexes all of that content, and then all these practitioners go in and get the resources that they want. The challenge was the specialization of these interfaces, or the context that was relevant to these specific practitioners, in some ways diminished because of the larger sort of indexing that's happened. And so this needed to be guided by theory, and so there is the author Charles Cole wrote a paper called Theory of Information Need, which was heavily influenced by Robert Tyler's paper around question negotiation and information seeking in libraries. And so Charles Cole did a really good job of identifying the various literature that's around to help identify what information need is, specifically around the context, the human condition, and eventually the information behaviors that are associated with it. So context being the problem situation, problem task, and then human condition related to sense making, evolutionary adaptation, foraging, and then information behaviors related to information search, seeking, and information use. So using this concept, we looked at what we would call the levels of information need, from pre-focus, focusing, and post-focus. I won't go into a lot of that, but I was able to put that into the scope of discovery and say, all right, all of what's in discovery is around the pre-focus, and then eventually you try and get to the post-focus phase for a single user. But what that meant from a single discovery perspective was you have what you would call the web scale discovery experience. And if I needed to improve that, we needed to introduce context into this mix, where we define user context, adopt group context, prioritize resources, and reduce noise and improve medical relevance. And so going into that, in some ways, we do apply context even when we implement discovery services. And so when we implement it for a specific institution, it is the institutional context. And so sometimes there are groups that we create, that is the group context. And so it just made sense that there is scope for user context as well. And that's where this sort of model comes into the mix, where you have the various practitioners who want their preferred content resources. This is where you could say a systems, an institutional services librarian or administrator could, they are the ones that can bridge the gap between the need of their customer or the user and the resources that they have subscribed to, or the institution has subscribed to, and they're the ones that can actually create these groups and templates because they are so close to the end user. And so based on this, at the pre-focus stage, or level, a user can come in and borrow a frame. They could either borrow something that a librarian has already set up for them, or if they have decided to take their own preferences, they can borrow their own preferences and come back and go into the system to do whatever the searching they need. So this is where, as and when focus formulates, they're able to go back in and update their resources and preferences. And then eventually you've got a phase where information fully formulates, and then you get to the context, where discovery then returns the more relevant information. It was a mixed method study here, where we did qualitative research with 5 clinicians, and their feedback was, yes, there was value in sort of the outcome of that model. There was also a more quantitative research with a confirmatory focus group. And then we did content analysis to confirm that, yes, there was validity and utility with this specific model when applied to a discovery service. Now that again is applying the context to a single system. And this is where the unified institutional services plays a big role, because now we have a context model, we have a unified system, and we put that together, and we now move towards knowledge formulation, which is a context aware and unified solution. And so this is a bulk of where we are headed in terms of the actual research that went into confirming what was going on here. So we looked at things, doing case studies and in-depth interviews with 3 library managers, specifically medical institute, medical center, and a university that's geared towards medical school. And yes, this looks a little more complicated because, but I won't go into it in a lot more detail because of my time. But these were the requirements. There were 13 requirements that came out of the literature. It was the theoretical framework for a lot of the case study that was sort of specific to the qualitative analysis. So the usefulness is, of course, the information need. And so we've identified what the requirements were from the system from that perspective. And then design science research has a fitness utility model, which is, can this practically be implemented at institutions? And so these things had to be factored into the interviews and the actual artifact development and evaluation as well. The end result is this is where a tool like OpenAthens will be able to let a user authenticate into the system and offer personalization. Now, personalization is completely up to the user. They can choose to do nothing with it, and you end up with an empty screen. And so as and when they interact with the system, you will end up with personalized, say, saved lists and all of that. Context and based on the research that we've done is slightly different in the sense when a user enters a system that is context aware, they have a choice. They can say, all right, you can either define your context or you can borrow context. So defining a context more or less aligns with personalization. And so borrowing a context is, this is where the library staff have the knowledge to say, all right, we know what a general practitioner needs. We know what a nurse needs, physiotherapist, medical researcher, etc. You can pick one of these, and based on that, the relevant information is going to flow through the system. And the concept of bento boxes was not as I guess concrete before this context process came, at least for me. And so the concept of bento boxes really started to shine through here in the sense from an end user perspective. I know the tiles that I want, and so I'm able to position these on the screen as I sort of browse and have a look. As I scroll down, I can add more tiles if I want to, depending on my context, etc. And again, I'm still in my group context, but as I go through, I'm then able to go in and say, okay, I want to deviate from the group context towards my own context itself. And so a tool like Discovery really helped me, I guess, identify what the actual, in some ways, taxonomy was. You could build your taxonomy yourself, or you could leverage a system that's already done it for you. And this is where Cloud Power was really powerful. And so there are facets around databases, source type, subject, publications, publishers that an end user potentially could click and select to define their context. This is exactly what a librarian potentially would use to create the groups as well. And so depending on that, if I do searches, I'm then able to get to my search results screen with the context applied beforehand. And so this was eventually the end result. This is where we have completed the prototype. We've confirmed with 3 institutions that there is validity, utility, including fitness of the solution. And this is currently out for publication. It's been peer reviewed. It's been in peer review for the past 60 days. Hopefully it'll get accepted and published, and I can then share that information once that's available as well. But that's pretty much a wrap. I think I'm on time, and hopefully we've got some time for questions.
Yes, perfectly on time, Alvet. We've had a question in. It's from John, actually. What are the biggest barriers to starting this transformation, and what do you think are the biggest barriers to successful delivery?
Sure. The biggest barriers is an understanding of the environment itself. And so most of the time it's easy for, let's say, folks in the library to be stuck in an individual component. And this is where I unfortunately was stuck for a long time in one single component. And we spend the time improving it, optimizing it, and giving it a lot of attention to the point where, you know, it was it wasn't healthy for the system overall. When you take a big step back and sort of take a systems thinking approach across the whole digital library, if you will, assuming that's the scope, you then say, okay, what is the purpose? And then you start to see these different components in a different light, as in they are there to be aligned towards the more focused goal of the system. And there may be overlaps between functionality at times, but then because you are now looking at the bigger picture systems thinking approach, you're able to identify, okay, let's use the system that's best suited for the role, and then leave out the functionality that of another system that's not really relevant. And you're able to interconnect and optimize. So I guess being able to step out of that individual components and then take a bigger view, and then realizing how the interconnect will be an interesting step towards this journey.
Thanks, Alvet. We've had another question come in the box, and I think I understand it. Well, one that they've said your presentation was amazing, and then they've asked if you're able to capture data from various sources, including EBSCO and non-EBSCO.
Well, that's correct. So that's the model at this point, which is the architecture basically says, look, you should be able to use the APIs and put that into a content management system. And this is why the emphasis on open source is quite heavy in the beginning of the research itself, where if we can use open source systems, we then have the ability to, I guess, invite programmers and developers to contribute and potentially look at piping more data into these different tiles from a bento box perspective.
Brilliant, thanks, Alvet. I think that's all the questions, and we've come to the end of the session. So I think it's probably a good time to say thank you. We all really enjoyed that, and move on to our next speaker.
Thank you.